introduced amendments to try to get votes on these, and occasionally we have. And the interesting thing is, all the Democrats, they don't care at all. But unfortunately, half the Republicans keep voting to send your money overseas as well. I had a bill, or an amendment, that I introduced in the Foreign Relations Committee probably 6 months ago. And it was a pretty simple amendment. It said that we should no longer send money to countries that persecute Christians.
Cool.
You say, well, what does that mean? Well, we defined it as death penalty or life imprisonment for interfaith marriage, for changing your religion, or for, they have other penalties for, they say, for criticizing your religion. But it's a death penalty in Pakistan for all three of those. There's about 25 countries that have the death penalty, and you give money to most of these countries. And so if people say, well, foreign aid's supposed to influence behavior, well, if it's going to influence behavior, maybe they ought to change some of their laws where they don't persecute Christians. But here's the sad thing, is that if you ask most of your neighbors, should we give money to countries that persecute Christians, you'll find almost nobody that supports that. But in Washington, it's the opposite. The vote was 18-2 to continue sending money to countries that are persecuting Christians. It was every Democrat and almost every Republican voted to continue doing it. And it's one thing if it were even surplus funds. It's not surplus. We're running a deficit. So we have to borrow the money from somewhere to send it out. It's obscene what's going on in Washington. You name it, one thing after another. I saw the other day, we're putting out a waste report, so we collect some of these things. We spent $200,000 to study what happens when you give Japanese quail cocaine. Or do they become sexually promiscuous? I'm not making this up. We spent $800,000 in Afghanistan developing a television show to watch cricket. They don't have TVs in Afghanistan. 0.003% of the public has a TV, but we're spending $800,000 of our money to develop a television program to watch cricket. We left $7 billion worth of equipment in Afghanistan when we left. ISIS now rides around in $1 billion worth of U.S. Humvees. Go figure. We had a big debate on this, and this is still the debate over who you want to represent us. Which way do we want the Republican Party to go? We had a debate over whether it was a good idea to send weapons to Islamic rebels in Syria. So I raised my hand and I said, do we know who these people are? Do we know that they like us and are going to defend us and our allies over there? There's 1,500 different groups fighting in Syria. This is 2 years ago. And I said the great irony is you give them weapons, we'll be back within a year fighting against our own weapons. That's where we are now. ISIS rides around in $1 billion worth of our Humvees. They have our anti-tank weapons. What did one of the groups say? The group we directly gave it to, which no longer exists anymore because they were defeated and ISIS took their weapons, but they said that they would use the weapons to take back the Golan Heights from Israel. So it's like, really? We're going to get involved in a war where these people have been hating each other for 1,000 years? And then people say, well, are you going to do anything? Well, yeah, I think we do have to protect our interests. One of the biggest criticisms I had of Hillary Clinton is she didn't defend our interest in Benghazi. She just let the place go. And we were warned time after time after time that there was a problem. It started about 9 months before the ambassador was shot. 9 months before the ambassador was shot, you know what Hillary Clinton was doing? Sending our special forces home. Why didn't they want the special forces in Libya? They didn't want to offend the sensibilities of the freedom fighters in Libya. Who are the freedom fighters in Libya? Jihadists, radical Islamists, people who hate America, some of whom were in our jails already. We'd already imprisoned them once. We let them out. Now they're fighting another war in Libya. So what are we doing? Supporting Al-Qaeda in Libya. So what do? They topple Gaddafi. What do we get? Chaos. We get the rise of radical Islam. Now, a third of Libya actually pledges allegiance to ISIS. So are we better off or worse off having toppled Gaddafi? This is my point, and this will be the debate in the presidential primary. Do you want to always intervene in every civil war around the world, and does it help us? Does it make us more safe? No. Now, there are things we do have to do. We should defend our embassies. We should defend our consulate. But as Hillary Clinton was getting request after request to defend the consulate in Benghazi, what was she doing? Bringing people home. Colonel Wood, who led the security team there, said he was specifically advised by the State Department, not to wear their military boots, because that was a show of force that would defend the freedom fighters in Libya. This goes on all summer long. All along, they're asking for more security. But you know what Hillary Clinton's spending the money on? She spent $100,000 sending 3 comedians to India on the Make Chai Not War tour. She spent $650,000 on Facebook ads. Seems the State Department doesn't have enough Facebook friends. She spent $700,000 on landscaping for the Brussels embassy. She spent $5 million on crystal glassware for the embassies. But in April or in August, when they were sending plea after plea to have more security, she told Colonel Wood and the final 16 people remaining there to defend the embassy to come home. So when Hillary Clinton came before my committee, I asked her this question. I said, did you read the cables from Ambassador Stevens? Did you read the cables pleading for more security? And she kind of acted put off and said, oh, like, that's beneath her. She didn't have time to be reading these cables. But you know my response to her? Hillary Clinton, by your dereliction of duty and by not defending our embassy, it should forever preclude her from being considered the president. People ask, how are we going to win? There's a real debate. How do Republicans win?
Everything from managing our business to farming our ground to raising our children. You know, it's a constitutional issue. He was one of the first political individuals that came out and said Planned Parenthood needed to be defunded. And he's sticking with that. So if you... You know, if you believe that things are going to change with the next election, it might just change because they're Republican, they're not going to. But they are going to change if you elect a senator like Rand Paul, and I believe that he is the best candidate to turn this country around. With that, Rand Paul.
I think it's the first time I've ever been compared to a prize steer. Sometimes if you are comparing the lot to steers, that might be pretty accurate or apt comparison. It's exciting to be here, not only to speak to you and be at the world's largest truck stop, but this morning I get to do something fun. Campaigning is not always fun, but I asked my staff, I said, can you get me a tryout with the Quad City River Bandits? So this morning I actually get up to go around. I don't know if they're, I'm calling it a tryout. I don't think they're going to. But actually I'm going to take batting practice over there this morning. And I enjoy playing sports. I grew up playing all the sports. I'm getting a little beyond the age of sports now. But we have a baseball game in Washington. The Republicans play the Democrats. The problem is the Democrats have been beating our butt for like the last 4 or 5 years. But they have a guy who played in college. It's a fun game though, it's for charity. It's played at Washington National Stadium. Everybody wears a uniform of a local team, either a local team in your state or a local college. So 4 years ago, I think we lost 27-0. Then we lost like 22-7, and then it was like 18-6 the third year. And then this year we got a close second, 5-2. We lost 5-2, but we're getting better. We just think maybe term limits for this guy. Or the other thought I've had is, you know what? These Democrats believe in so many regulations. Why don't we just pass a regulation that says that their good pitcher can only pitch for 2 innings?
There you go.
So far, not one of them has taken me up on it. How many people here think that you're not paying enough in taxes and you want to have me raise your taxes? All right, I'm in the right crowd. I think taxes are too high. I think government's too big. And I think if you want more jobs created in our country, let's make it friendlier to do business. We have a 70,000-page tax code. And basically that tax code has become so complicated and the rates so high that I think we're chasing jobs overseas. We're chasing companies overseas and we're chasing jobs overseas. They have a fancy name for it. They call it inversion. It's when a company that's incorporated here incorporates overseas to get rid of our tax burden. The tax on businesses, the corporate income tax, is 35%. In Canada, it's 15%. I'm embarrassed that I have to compliment Canada with regard to 500 people. And their corporate tax rate is 35%. That's great, and they're doing wonderfully. But let's say their corporate tax rate is 35%. What if we made it 15? You think they'd hire more people? Yes. Yep. Or buy something else in the community? Their money will go somewhere, and it will be good for the economy. But if you say, oh no, we'd rather send our money to Washington and ask them for a certain portion back. The problem is that you have voted for their business here. People around the country have voted for their business to succeed. It's called democratic capitalism. Nobody in Washington said, we want the biggest truck stop and put it right here. If you send the money to Washington and you ask me to bring it back to you, then I have to come back to your community and say, oh, well, Mr. Smith would be good at running a Pizza Hut. Here's $100,000. Well, 9 out of 10 people who start a business fail. So it's extraordinary when a business succeeds. But that can only be selected by you. So that's the debate. Should you send it to Washington and then ask your representatives to give some back? The problem is when they want to give it back, who do they give it back to? Their friends and their cronies who gave them money. Mm-hmm. So think about it this way. President Obama thinks government can create jobs. So he gave $500 million to a guy that makes solar panels. It just turns out that they lost all of that money. It was called Solyndra. But it also turns out that the guy who ran the company was the 20th richest man in the country. Why would we be giving a government loan to a rich person? He can get a loan anywhere he wants. He could have funded that company out of his wealth. Why would we be getting involved? Milton Friedman put it this way: when you're trying to decide whether you want government to do something or the private economy, he said, nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as your own. Think about it. You know, if I ask you for $1,000, are we going to ask them for $1,000 later? Yeah. But let's say I'm starting a business, though, and I ask you each for $1,000 to start a business. You're going to think long and hard about it. How long did it take you to work to get it? You probably had to pay. You probably had to earn $2,000 to have $1,000 left over. But you'll think about your labor involved. You'll also think about, is it a good investment or a bad investment? And you'll think about what happens if I lose it all. Contrast your feeling, that feeling in your gut about buying a house, making a payment, having a business, paying employees, that feeling that everybody gets in their gut. Contrast that feeling with a government employee. Now, do you think the guy that gave the loan to Solyndra is laying awake at night, worried that he lost $500 million? It wasn't his money. He doesn't care. And even, let's say, the civil servants want to do the right thing, can they really feel it the same way you feel it? That's why we have a decision. We have a decision. Where is the money better spent? I think it's better spent left with the people, and I think it's better to have a smaller government. There's another argument for small government I call the liberty argument. Thomas Paine put this forward at the beginning of our republic, and he said, government is a necessary evil. And you're like, oh, well, that sounds really bad to call government evil. And I'm part of government, so it's not all evil. Right? But when we say government is a necessary evil, we're admitting that we need government. I'm not arguing against government. But when we say it's a necessary evil, you have to give up some of your freedom. How do you give up your freedom? You've got to pay taxes. And I'm not arguing for no taxes either. But I am arguing that if I taxed you 100%, you would have given up all of your freedom. So nobody wants that. But what if we tax you 50%? Most people who own a Pizza Hut or a McDonald's or any kind of small business, their income isn't through a corporate income tax, it's actually passed through an individual. Most people who own a business are paying 42% taxes, and then you add on to that, if they live in a state that has state income taxes, you add that on to as well. Many people who run businesses are paying 50%. How do we create jobs? Raise their taxes or lower their taxes? But here's the rub. We've had Republicans for a long time. Some of them say they're for cutting taxes, but you know what happens in the end? Most of them in Washington have sort of forgotten what they were for. I mean, I'm there in the Republican caucus every day, and I can tell you not one of them, that's not true. Very few of them want to cut taxes. You know what they're for? They're for revenue neutral tax reform. That means half of you pay more, half of you pay less, and the net result is zero. Well, if you're for that, how are we going to stimulate the economy? How are we going to grow the economy if we're going to keep sending millions and billions of dollars to Washington? How are we going to do that if we keep sending our money up there? But that's what they're for, revenue neutral tax reform. And I tell people, look, no one's going to go knock on a door for you if that's what you're for. Hey, my candidate's for revenue neutral tax reform. Do you want to vote for him? Who cares? I tell people, if that's what we're for, I'm going home.
Right.
I mean, I didn't leave my medical practice and spend all this time away from my family to be for nothing. We ought to be for smaller government. You know the last president we had that really wanted smaller government, lower taxes? Reagan. He dramatically cut taxes. The income tax rate was 70, he took it to 50, and then he took it to 28, the top rate. What happened? Revenue actually increased over time and jobs increased by the millions. Let's have this debate. Let's have a real debate. So in our tax plan, we get rid of the whole tax code and replace it with one rate, 14.5%. Dramatically lower for businesses and for individuals. Now Democrats will say, well, that's only going to help rich people. Well, have you ever worked for a poor person? But there's a further argument we can do to try to encourage people who aren't rich to say this will be good for me. What we do in our tax plan is we get rid of the payroll tax. We take the payroll tax and we put it under the business tax. And so what would happen is if you make $40,000 a year, you pay about $2,000 in payroll tax, your FICA, your Social Security tax, you wouldn't pay it anymore and come out of the business end of it. So everybody making $40,000 a year would have $2,000 more in their check. You say, well, how are we going to pay for Social Security? We pay for it out of the business tax, and we mandate that the first dollars out of the business tax go to fully fund Social Security and fully fund Medicare. You say, well, there won't be enough money for all the rest of government. Precisely. Government will have to be smaller. That's the argument. But you can't argue for lower taxes if you're not going to argue for smaller government. But I'm willing to do both. Dramatically lower, simpler taxes to stimulate the economy and create millions of jobs, but also dramatically smaller government. I'd get rid of whole departments. Department of Education. There's no reason to have a Department of Education in Washington. You can do it locally, but there's no reason to have it in Washington. I grew up in a time when there was no Department of Education. Our scores are equal or better to what kids are doing now. There's no reason to have it done in Washington. You can do it at your state and local level. Even now, people don't realize this. They say, oh gosh, if we got rid of the Department of Education, what would happen to our local high school? Your local high school is financed 95% by your local taxes. You're already paying for it. What you're paying for in the Department of Education is thousands and thousands of bureaucrats. We send the money up there. They insult us with what they tell us to do and what they want us to do. They insult everyone, from parents to teachers to principals. I don't think your teachers can be judged whether they're good teachers by somebody in Washington. I don't think that anybody in Washington has a clue whether your schools are good or whether your teachers are good. You ought to decide that locally. Should kids take tests? Sure, they probably ought to take tests. But when I was a kid, we took a California Achievement Test, a national test, to compare ourselves. But our local school board decided which one we were going to take. There's an Iowa test as well. Sometimes I think we took the Iowa test, sometimes the California test. We didn't take 10 tests every year, and the teachers weren't beleaguered with weeks and weeks and weeks of preparing for all the tests and no time to really teach. So we need to get rid of that. We got to get rid of the Department of Commerce. It's mostly corporate welfare. Just get rid of it. You know, Department of Energy, 95% of that could go.
Yep.
You know, so there's a lot of things in government you would make smaller, but realize by making government smaller, you're making your freedom bigger, and we're also making the private economy bigger. There's two sectors of the economy. The government sector, which is the non-productive sector, which drains money but doesn't create jobs. And then there's a private sector, which is the productive sector. It's the engine. This is the engine that won the Cold War. So we have to make that decision. But in making a decision over which of the 55 Republicans you're going to vote for, you need to make the decision based on who will actually change things. There's an enormous amount of inertia up there. Some have said we need to dilute what we stand for. Some have said, let's just be Democrat light. Be more like the Democrats, and that's how we'll win. I think that's the opposite of what we should do. I think we should be more boldly for what we are for. Balanced budgets, lower taxes, smaller government. But then I think there needs to be something beyond that. If you talk to young people, and we're doing pretty well with young people don't have any money, they don't have a job, they don't have a business, they don't really care about taxes or regulations so much. All the standard Republican stuff, they don't care about that. So I don't say we give up on it. We still should believe in what we believe in, absolutely. But for young people, let's try to figure out where they are. That's why we get on Twitter and Instagram and all these other things so we can get our message to them. We also talk about some issues that are important to them. We talk about the right to be left alone, the right to privacy, the right to not have the government looking at all your phone records. And people say, well, how are we going to catch terrorists if we don't look at all the phone records? Well, number one, we've been looking at your phone records for 10 years now. We've studied it and studied it and studied it. We've not caught one terrorist by looking at all your phone records. It's not working, practically not working. The courts have said it's illegal. Many are arguing it's unconstitutional. Many, like myself, have said, you know what? Our republic was founded upon the Fourth Amendment. John Adams said it was the spark that led to our revolution. And what's the Fourth Amendment about? It's that we can collect your records if we have suspicion. If we have your name on a warrant, we ask a judge. Warrants are pretty easy to get. And I am for looking at more information of potential terrorists, but just less indiscriminate information from all of us. If I have your phone records, I can tell what your religion is 85% of the time. I can tell who your doctors are 100% of the time. I can make a good guess as to what procedures you get at the doctor's office and how long you talk to somebody on the phone. If I have your credit card bills, I can tell whether you gamble, whether you smoke, whether you drink, and how much. I can tell what books you read, what magazines you read. That's no business of the government. The thing is we need to be left alone. We need this right to privacy. And when you advocate for it, I'm the only one on the stage that's been an advocate for it. Jeb Bush says that's the thing he loves about President Obama. Christie said he wants to hug Obama again and tell him how much he loves this And I don't think the American people are there. If you ask people under 40, 83% of people under 40 think the government went too far. It was a mistake to let President Obama collect all the phone records. So it's a way we can encourage and get new people into our party. We also ought to be the party of justice. If you want new people in our party, you want to be a more diverse party, we can't be the white party. We need to be the party that's rich, poor, white, black, and brown. We need more people from a more different variety of backgrounds. Right now, it's not a huge deal in Iowa, it's not a huge deal in Kentucky because we don't have large African-American populations. If you want to win Michigan, you want to win Pennsylvania, you want to win Illinois, you want to win Ohio, we have to get more African-American votes. How do you do it? Same message, but you got to show up. So I've been going to the south side of Chicago, I've been going to Detroit, I've been going to Philadelphia. You know what I've been telling them? Sending your money to Washington isn't coming back, it's not helping poverty. I have a tax plan that would leave $1 billion in Detroit. I'm not going to take your money and send it to Detroit, but I'll leave $1 billion in Detroit. And you know what? People are starting to listen. Most African Americans are Democrats, but they're tired. They've been taken advantage of by the Democrats. Democrats think they're always going to vote for them. And so guess what? Nobody goes to the south side of Chicago. No Democrats go, and no Republicans go. Democrats think the vote's guaranteed. Republican thinks the vote's lost. So I've been showing up. I've been talking about school choice, making the schools better, letting you go to the school of your choice if your school's a bad school. Talking about leaving more money in their communities. And then I've been talking about one other thing, and this is criminal justice reform. And this applies in all communities, but it's more desperate in poor communities. And that's that people are being arrested for nonviolent drug crimes and being put in jail for 10, 15 years, sometimes life. You know, we can punish this. We can try to make people get drug tested. We can try to get them to work. All the good things that could happen. But putting a kid in jail for 15 years for making a mistake with drugs is a mistake. And then you look at it, and disproportionately the people in jail are poor, or black, or brown, or all three. And the thing is that, you know, Jeb Bush says, I smoked some pot when he was in Andover. I don't care. A lot of kids made, some people, maybe one or two of you did too. Maybe a few more. But the thing is that what happens is, he went to Andover, a rich elite school. I don't have any problem with that. I'm pretty well off. I'm not criticizing him for being rich. But the police don't patrol the dorms in Andover. But the police patrol all the time in the south side of Chicago. And I'm not blaming the police, they've got to. There's crime, and so they have to patrol the streets. But what happens is, day in, day out, more poor people get collected. The marijuana arrests are like 15-to-1 black to white. And black population is, 10% of our overall population. I'm saying if we take a message of fairness on criminal justice, of maybe treating it not so much as we're going to incarcerate you forever, but maybe a second chance. It should involve work, might involve drug testing, there's all kinds of things it could involve. But if we take that approach, all of a sudden I think more people are going to open up to us. I'm already seeing it. Right now, when you poll me against Hillary Clinton, we lead her in 5 states won by President Obama. Discharge pollutants into a navigable stream. Well, over time though, they came to define dirt as a pollutant and your backyard or your farm as a stream. Well, that's insane, and it ought to stop, but I didn't get to vote on it. No congressman votes on any of this. It's all done by the president. It's done by unelected bureaucrats.
That's right.
And we need to stop it. If elected, I'll be the first president who says, I'm not going to take more power, I'm going to give it back. Give it back to the states and the people, and we'll have no more of this nonsense.
Thank you, Senator. Go ahead. My parents were World War II vets. When my mother died about 6-7 years ago, her income was a little over $12,000 a year. At that particular time, illegal aliens were more than double that for their income through various welfare, government programs, and this and that. What about the illegal alien problem? I still refer to them as illegal aliens because that's what they are.
A nation without borders and without control of their borders is not really a nation. Milton Friedman said you can't have an open border and a welfare state. We've got a little bit of both going on. It all stems from having or lacking the will from the president to enforce the border. Congress passes laws, but we don't have the enforcement agency. So I'm not in charge of immigration services. I can appropriate money to them, but the president actually has to enforce the policy and make it happen. This president doesn't care about controlling the border. He sees anybody that comes across as a future voter. And so they don't care at all. However, I would tell you the Republican presidents haven't cared either. In 1986, we had 3 million people in the country illegally. We granted them legal status in exchange for border security. But the border security never came. We now have 11 million more, so that's a little bit of an evidence that no one's securing the border. If you were to enforce the law that are on the books right now, you could have a secure border and it would end. I think we need to have a working visa program. So I'm not against all immigrants. I think you cut all immigrants out of here, your crops won't get picked and farm. I know you don't use as much here, but like in Kentucky, I know farmers, they advertise for Americans and they have to advertise for Americans to be part of the migrant worker program. Can't get any Americans. I know guys advertised for 30 years and never had one American apply. So he has 20 or 30 migrant workers. So I'm not completely against people coming up here to work, people who want to be part of the American dream, but it has to be lawfully. And you have to be checked, you have to have a background check. I mean, it's horrendous what happened to that beautiful young girl in San Francisco to be killed by somebody who they let loose. I've introduced a bill to end sanctuary cities. I've introduced a bill to take away their federal funding and say that it is mandatory that they have to obey a court order from a federal government agency. Let me say one more thing. It's interesting how that came about. President Obama changed the interpretation of the rules that have been on the books. They're supposed to obey orders, but he just kind of made it optional. Go ahead.
Well, with regards to the sanctuary cities, I think Iowa is kind of a disaster in the sense that we've got sanctuary counties, many of them.
I did the same thing. No federal funds if you're not going to obey the law. And here's a good analogy for people who question. I doubt anybody's going to question on this, but if they do. If someone in Iowa, or let's say someone in the western part of Illinois is in a jail for shoplifting, but they're wanted in Iowa for murder, Iowa sends a notice to the jail and says, hey, we want that guy for murder. Do you think Illinois ever releases him and says, screw you, Iowa, we're just going to let him out to the public? That never happens. The only time it ever happens is under immigration law. But immigration law can also want somebody who is a murderer. And you shouldn't be allowed to ignore a valid federal court order that says you're supposed to detain somebody who's wanted for a crime. And the other thing is if you don't do it, if you leave it open, you get more. And you encourage more people to go if they know you're not going to enforce the law. We had a humanitarian crisis about a year ago with 50,000 kids on the border. Of course, we brought them all in and distributed them everywhere from Alaska to Maine. But that happened is because everybody in Central America heard that we had a law that said if you weren't from Mexico, any other Central American country, it's called other than Mexico, we welcome you because we're worried about sexual trafficking, which I am too, and I don't want any of that. But because we said anybody could come and request asylum, they all came. So I mean, you have to have rules, and I don't want them just people who are being hounded or in sexual trafficking. We should help them. One of the ways we can help them is many Americans want adoption. They've shut down adoption. There's no more adoption coming from Central America for a variety of other reasons. But thousands of Americans will adopt kids and give them great lives from Africa, from Central America. But we shut that down, and then we have this big, huge border problem. So there's so many answers, but it all originates with the president who will actually enforce the law, and I will.